This is a one-off session of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee on the situation in Syria. And we have oral evidence today. We're very grateful we have two panels this afternoon. And the first panel is, I wonder if you could introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Lina Khatib. I've been working on Syria for a very, very, very long time, since before the conflict, and I'm an associate fellow with Chatham House.
A Middle East and North Africa programme.
Yeah. And
we've met you at least once before, and thank you very much for helping us. So when Chatham House did their briefing for us, you were very helpful in the evidence you gave us. And please.
I'm Simon Collis. I was the last British ambassador to Syria. I closed the embassy in February 2012, 1 year into the uprising. After that, I was ambassador in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and the last 5 years I've been working in doing consultancy work in the Middle East.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for coming. We have a number of questions, but perhaps I should start with the obvious one. Were you surprised by the sudden collapse of the Assad regime in December?
I was not, because I knew that it was going to happen, simply because I was in touch with people inside Syria who were part of the plan, and also some other actors outside who were seeing this and anticipating that the regime was just really hollow, when most of the Western world was assuming that the regime was pretty solid, even though it had shrunk. The people in the region and on the ground were seeing things and acting very differently. And I think the surprise really applies to those who were outside, who just felt comfortable with the dominant narrative that this was a regime that had been resilient and mostly won, and were frankly not paying enough attention to what was happening on the ground, because Syria was no longer a policy priority or even a media priority.
But Dr. Khatib, I hear you, but I mean, it was resilient. It had resisted an uprising for a long period of time, and it did seem to be in control. So for those of us who certainly did have our eye off the ball, what was it that we missed? What was happening?
For example, the evolution of groups like HTS. I am not contesting the designation of the group as terrorist. However, I think no matter what we designate groups as, we should constantly follow the way they are changing, because they could change even as terrorist groups. And with HTS, for example, I was one of the first people to flag all the way back in 2015, when they weren't HTS, they were a group at the time known as the Nusra Front. I was one of the first to publicly write about the pragmatism that I saw this group embracing. And I wrote at that time that this is a group that has political ambitions, that wants to be at the table whenever transformation in Syria becomes possible, and that they were at the time heading further away from al-Qaeda, even though they were at the time allied with al-Qaeda. And I was saying at the time that they are engaged in battles with ISIS, and that, perhaps they could become an actor on the anti-ISIS kind of side of the equation. And here we are 10 years later, and this is exactly what happened. So this process of evolution did not happen overnight. HTS didn't suddenly become an actor that has political ambitions and has the capacity to administer areas in Syria. This is something it built up over time. So this is the kind of thing that I think is missed when groups are simply labeled as terrorist, because this means that the focus becomes just on that kind of activity and misses all the other things that the group is doing.
I wonder, would you mind answering the same question? Were you surprised?
Yes. I think what was surprising was the speed with which it happened. There's the old saying about how you go bankrupt slowly and then fast. Yes. I think the regime had been hollowing out, as Dr. Lina described. There was clearly no future, no long-term future with the regime. there have been 4 years of the frozen conflict from 2020 when they didn't take the opportunity to advance. And of course, their heavy reliance on support from Iran, from Lebanese Hezbollah and from Russia after the conflict in Ukraine began. Russia's distracted. After the Gaza conflict began, Hezbollah decimated and Iran falling back. So the regime's external pillars of support were not there any longer.
There's something about the army not being paid as well.
I think that, well, the army was brutalised. The foot soldiers in the army were cannon fodder all the way through, and even at the higher levels. The regime had become, for a long time, basically a crime family. The Assad Maklouf family were a crime family and acted and behaved like a crime family with their control of resources. And
is it true that his brother was running a criminal enterprise?
Yes. Maher was their main source of revenue, it seems, was the Captagon trade, this amphetamine drug trade, mainly.
We're going to ask some more questions about that later.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were surprised?
Surprised at the speed. I suspect that Ahmed Sharaa was surprised at how quickly he got from Aleppo to Hama. Once they reached Homs, I think they knew they would get Damascus. Homs was the last place where the regime could have taken a stand. Mm-hmm. But to the speed with which they got from Aleppo then to Hama, and once it was clear that the regime was unable or unwilling, incapable of defending Homs, that's the hinge that connects Damascus with the coastal and mountain areas, the Alawite heartland. There's no sustainable regime after that. But yeah, it happened very quickly. The fact that it would happen eventually, I think, was clear. But the precise timing of it, what was unexpected, not just internationally, but many people inside Syria didn't expect it to happen that quickly. Mm-hmm. Mm.
Before I open up to other questions, let me just ask it this way then. So, because I think that it's our job as the Select Committee to always try to input positively into the role of the Foreign Office. And I suppose the question the public might be asking is, well, what more could the Foreign Office have done to predict this? Because everybody seems to have been taken by surprise. I think perhaps Dr. Kabir may have some answers on that. Do tell us.
Well, I can tell you, I did tell the Foreign Office what I knew.
Right.
In February 2024.
Right.
And I reminded them of that, and I did tell them in writing. So for the record, I did relay all the information that I had about what was going on in Syria. It's just that, to be honest, at that time, like many other countries in Europe, the US, Syria was just not a priority. So even if you receive information about things changing on the ground, ultimately, if it's not a foreign policy priority for the country, this information is only going to be filed away as, oh, this person told us this. And so for me, this is the key thing I would urge is not to fall into comfort.
Yes.
When it comes to how we approach whether this region or any other region.
Yes. It's the question of frozen conflicts, isn't it? And that people feel if something is frozen, it can be just sort of filed away somewhere and the more pressing problems can be dealt with instead, right?
Yeah, I mean, no status quo is necessarily permanent. It's often policy that puts it in that particular box because, obviously the Foreign Office has the whole world to deal with and not every region can be a top priority. However, when it comes to the Middle East, there is a particular situation that I see being repeated, which is that conflicts become normalized. So it's expected that this region will have conflicts that are frozen or that go on for a very long time, but only simmer. And as we saw with the October 7 horrific attack by Hamas and this situation in Syria, honestly, there is no such thing as a simmering conflict that we can live with.
Yes, very well put. Is there anything you want to say, Mr. Collis? We're not beating you up. We appreciate that you had left the Foreign Office.
No, I've been out for 5 years, and I'm not here to certainly not here to speak for them directly. I think that on the question of whether things could have been predicted, I'm not sure how big a difference it would have made actually to what happened on the ground. Let's say people thought that there was a high probability of the regime collapsing over a set time frame. You know, the fact that it would eventually collapse, I think, was not. Nobody expected that regime to endure. It had no future. There was no future for Syria under that regime. But the question of the timing of its collapse and the nature of the eventual collapse, I'm not sure that there would have been much different to be done from a policy perspective if there had been more focus. I think the more interesting question is what should happen now.
Well, I think you may find that's the next question.
Very good.
John, I think, do you mind picking up on that? We were just saying the question is what's going to happen now.
Well, I mean, in particular, I wanted to come in on the question about drug production.
Yes. But I think that there is a question about the stability of the current government, isn't there? And what's the assessment of stability of the current government? And I think the drug production is obviously an important aspect of it.
But in the more general question about the stability, to what extent does HTS now control Syria? And what are the relations with the other groups like, and to what extent is there a possibility of a relatively stable government emerging in the near future?
Yeah.
It's the key question, and I think Syria is in a very dangerous phase right now. It's a fragile phase, and it's a little concerning to see the extent to which media attention has already moved on. This is why I think it's very welcome that this committee is looking at Syria right now, less than 2 months in. The HTS leadership seems to be a small circle in Damascus. Like groups with the sort of background they have, you're going to have a small number of people who have been working tightly together with very limited trust for outsiders for a long time. That's that bond there that is hard to break. And you could argue that some people have, that the success they had in Idlib, controlling Idlib, which is very difficult terrain geographically, the human geography was very difficult, with people flooding in from all different parts of the country, internally displaced people, and to have established control, and through that a measure of security and the ability to deliver services, was basically achieved, as far as I could see from a distance, by a readiness to, as they went on their political journey, a readiness to say to the rival factions, you can join us, or we will deal with you. And through that, they were able to make progress. And there does need to be some kind of toughness in the present phase to avoid chaos, to avoid anarchy, with all of the different groups still active, and the diversity in Syria's demography and the geography. But at a national level, what worked in Idlib will not work at a national level. And we're seeing the invitations to the groups, the factions, to lay down their arms, to present them to the National Ministry of Defence, for fighters to join, to come under the umbrella of a National Ministry of Defence, but not as groups. The groups get dissolved. And they're being invited, the Kurds, the Druze, others, are being invited to do this in the absence of clarity as yet about what the transition will look like, what the national convention will look like. And I think that so the Idlib model of imposing security and then moving on to governance may have worked in that place at that time. But I think if that is the national model, if it's attempted to be the national model, it will be more difficult. And so I think it is important for anybody who can influence these things to, from the outside, to lean in, to encourage the HTS leadership to lead the process, because if they don't, there will be anarchy. They must lead it, but not in an exclusive way.
Given your experience in the Middle East and having observed other sort of collapses of strong authoritarian regimes and potentially chaos that follows, I mean, how optimistic are you?
I think optimism is actually the pragmatic response. That there are clearly risks, but there is nothing to be gained by the UK or other countries with any potential influence, sitting back to wait and see, and then having the satisfaction of eventually being proved right about our pessimism. You know, optimism is the pragmatic course. It's not a matter of wishful thinking. It's a matter of understanding that this is a moment to lean in.
What does lean in mean, though? Lean in mean having a photograph taken with the current leadership. Does it mean recognising the current leadership? What does it mean? I mean,
but it does mean engagement. It doesn't mean necessarily lifting the sanctions on HTS or on the leadership figures, as long as those measures are not a barrier to engagement with them. They have a past, they have a history, they've been on a journey. Let's make sure that it's a future, and that those measures may provide a measure of leverage to encourage progress. We're not going to pretend that they're somebody who, you know, they've completely changed. But the sanctions against Syria as a country, I see no basis for those to be maintained. They were put in place because of the actions of the previous regime, the Assad regime. That regime is gone. The justification for the sanctions is gone. And the idea that we've seen coming out of Brussels yesterday and of taking an incremental approach to this as if it's a dial that you can fine-tune, I think is mistaken, dangerously mistaken.
Your advice is just that Britain just lifts sanctions, unlike the Europeans?
For there to be, yes, for trade to resume. There are humanitarian reasons for this, there are legal reasons for this, but it's also pragmatic politics. If it all goes wrong, sanctions can be brought back. Nothing to stop them being brought back. But this is a period to give the people in Syria the best chance of moving forward, and that's going to involve, you know, allowing them to deal with the humanitarian situation, which is acute. You know, the hours of power in Damascus and other cities minimal. For there to be political progress to be made, for there to be that opportunity, people are going to have a chance to get beyond that level of having to fight for your daily needs in order to, you know, you're going to have to make some progress there in order to be able to think politically in a rational and expansive way. So lift the sanctions, yeah.
Yes, and perhaps Dr. Khatib, if you have anything to add to what Mr. Collis has already said.
Yes, first of all, I agree with everything that has been presented.
Then you don't need to repeat it. We're just
no, I'm not going to repeat it.
We can just take it that you agree, and then if you would add, but I know that you have like extra insights.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I wanted it noted that I do agree. For example, lifting the sanctions.
I have to give some impression of controlling these proceedings.
What we need to bear in mind is that this administration in Syria is very keen on international legitimacy. It wants to be regarded as legitimate. Even if it's, for the moment, temporary, it wants to be seen as legitimate. And therefore, this means we have an opportunity to have influence in this kind of setting in a positive way. One of the things that we can have influence over is this issue of what inclusion means when it comes to Syria's governance. Right now, the situation is temporary. There is meant to be an interim government formed in March. That will be the real test of what inclusion actually means. Does inclusion mean this current HTS-dominated administration continues and grants privileges to, for example, other groups in Syria? or does it mean power sharing and not using the Lebanese-Iraqi disastrous model of allocation of seats based on sectarian or ethnic background? What we need to try to push for is basically embracing the values of liberal democracy when it comes to power sharing and inclusion. And there is potential for us and our allies to, nurture Syria in that kind of way. So that's something we can do.
So I don't understand. So are you saying, therefore, that we should lift sanctions straight away, but not give them any other credibility until after March?
No, we need to encourage all the positive steps. And this is about looking at governance in Syria, not just from the perspective of who's in formal positions, but as an inclusive social contract between the people who are in charge and society. And that means those voices right now who are calling for inclusion, for women to play a meaningful role, for secular people to be represented. Civil society in Syria has had years to actually become a civil society, because under Assad there was no civil society. So these kinds of actors need to be involved in the policy debate and in being able to set policy for their country. So that's something we can definitely work on. So you lift sanctions, but you also nurture all these positive conversations happening about inclusion, because we can do a lot in that regard, and they need our help. So here's something that we can also do in a concrete way. If you want more ideas for what we can do in a concrete way, I'm very happy to provide them.
You wanted to ask about drugs, is it?
Well, I was just going to ask quickly on that point,
yeah, go on.
actually, which is something that I know we've had discussions, some of those members who had the opportunity to go to Jordan fairly recently, and at the invitation of the Jordanian government, was around the fact that the rules of the future Syrian society is going to be based by the people who are there, and there is obviously an enormous amount of people who are currently outside of Syria, and to what extent it's possible to build an inclusive government when you have so many people who are currently not living in the country. I don't know if you have a view on that.
I mean, a lot of people are already going back or want to go back. And when I say a lot of people, I mean these people who are in positions of potential influence, the people who got involved in think tanks outside, academics, civil society actors, people who formed political parties. A lot of these people did all these things outside in preparation for one day going back, because if they weren't interested in going back, why are they doing all this work for Syria outside? So now it's still early days. We have to remember we're only in January. This thing only happened, last month. So it's still very early days. So we should be realistic about when these people can basically uproot themselves from their homes abroad and move back. But there are very serious efforts being made that would really benefit from the expertise of the Syrians outside. So personally, I wouldn't put a separation between outside and inside at the moment. Of course, there are people outside who have become disconnected and who may be opportunistic. This happens in every context like that. But the people on the inside who were living under the Assad regime had very limited space to breathe. And so they also want those people outside to come and work in partnership with them to build the new Syria. So I don't think at the moment the inside-outside separation is helpful.
I know that you need to go in a minute, Afra, and I wondered if you had a question in relation to this particular, where we've got to in this debate. Or I know that you had some questions on Turkey that I think Phil will cover, but do you have anything now that you want to ask?
I'm fine for now, so that's fine, yes. And Phil's kindly offered to...
I'm sorry about this.
No, I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Edward, do you want to...
Well, I was interested just now on the drug side, but I don't...
No, but
we'll piggyback.
We're both interested.
So,
away.
They were both on the border between Syria and Jordan just last week, so they're both interested in knowing what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Collis, you talked about the Assad regime being a criminal enterprise. It was obviously also a narco state with something like 90 or 80% of the world's capture and production happening inside Syria. What I am interested to understand is to what extent the new regime or HTS in the areas that they control, are they dealing with the drug production? Are they eliminating it? Have we seen any kind of reduction in production and smuggling?
Yes. My understanding is that they've basically eliminated it, stopped it. That's been a clear priority for Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the other Gulf states that were victims of the transit and trafficking and consumption of Captagon. The trade was run...
Can I just ask, I mean, within those countries, how bad was it? Or do we know?
It's hard to see data, but I know from talking to senior Saudis that they were seriously concerned about it. They have spoken about it publicly, but the private concern was even greater.
And as a drug that we don't necessarily know that well, it's very addictive, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is this kind of upgraded version of speed.
Unlike, for instance, Afghanistan, where a large proportion of the population were involved in growing opium, as I understand it, Captagon is not, it doesn't require large numbers of people, it's just a few people in a laboratory.
Yes, some chemicals, and you cook it and distribute it, so it's the perfect product for criminal gangs.
And it's small,
the number involved in employment is probably not that great, but obviously the revenue which supported the regime was considerable.
It was yes, it was huge, billions of dollars, probably the largest single component of the economy in the final years.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I am interested in this money issue, because I've seen figures of anywhere between 5 billion and 55 billion US in terms of the size of the Captagon market. So I guess my question for Dr. Khatib, if I may, is if you've got a regime right now, if you've got a new Syria right now, which obviously doesn't have a source of income, is there any risk that actually we see the new regimes or criminal gangs or whoever it might be turning back to the Captagon market in order to bring revenue back into the country?
Definitely not the Captagon market. As we heard, they have been finding and publicly exposing warehouses where Captagon was stored in areas that used to be under the control mainly of the 4th Division, headed by Maher al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's brother, who was the main person leading on the Captagon trade inside Syria. And also, as we heard, with Saudi Arabia, because that was a big market for the export of Captagon from Syria, and the new administration in Syria is very keen to have smooth relations with Saudi Arabia. So the last thing they will want is to reactivate a trade that Saudi Arabia was very, very concerned about. And you can see this through the behavior of this new administration vis-à-vis Saudi Arabia. The first diplomatic visit by the new administration abroad was to Riyadh. The first interview that Ahmed al-Shara gave was to a Saudi television station. And now we've seen the Saudi foreign minister, having visited Damascus, which, something that hadn't happened in a very long time. And so I think we can safely predict that scenario that you mentioned is not going to happen.
Very good. Blair, you've got some questions.
You talked a moment ago about the importance of inclusion, and HTS have obviously spoke a lot about that. I guess the flip side of that for me is justice for things that have happened in the past. And it's remarkable to me how little of the debate since Assad has fallen has been about justice for the past. I mean, I guess partly that's because he's fled off to live with someone else who has his own troubles to seek with international justice. But how important do you think justice for past crimes is for HTS, and is there a balancing job they have to do there with inclusion?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, these issues are important everywhere, and that includes Syria. Syrian society is no different. I think what has been one of the things that has been remarkable so far, when you look at the discovery, the opening up of Sinai prison and the other prisons, and just the sheer scale of the torture and the detentions and the murder that took place there. at least 150,000, probably more. And through a conflict where over half a million were killed, and maybe 80% of those at the hands of the regime. So the question of justice will be an issue. I think it is remarkable how little reprisal killing there has been so far.
Is it? But it has. I mean, sorry to jump in. But can we be sure that there hasn't been?
There has been. There has been, but it's been limited. Quite a lot of it has been spontaneous, local groups. It's not been directed from the centre. There have been, really in the last few days, and you may have more information, Lina, but there have been a couple of episodes where it looks like HTS-directed forces went into a couple of villages in the Homs area to attempt to arrest prominent figures from the previous regime who had been involved in high-profile massacres, massacres where women and children were murdered, not just fighters.
That was reported in the media, wasn't it?
Yeah, and then so there was an attempt at detention, it seems, that turned into a firefight, and these people were killed.
Can I ask to take that operation in, for example, is what's driving that the people who conducted the massacre are a security threat to the regime, or is it about justice and retribution?
Well, all of these things connect. So there will be, when HTS took Damascus and the other cities, they allowed senior members of the previous regime to disappear. A lot of those people have gone to the mountains, to the extent that they were Alawites. They will be sitting there in the mountain now with weapons, waiting to see what happens. And if they don't have a political future, then we may see violence resume. I think HTS forces are spread quite thinly. This is why it is so important to maintain a political momentum, and a component of that will have to be justice. I think it's not helped by the fact that the HTS figure who was appointed Minister of Justice is somebody who, it seems, accepted those videos were genuine, as a judge in Idlib, presided over what in effect was the street execution of women in a way that I find disgraceful, but also unnecessary. You can see why, when in the struggle to put some governance into Idlib, they may have felt it necessary to use violence in order to establish dominance so that you can get security, because without that nothing happens. But to summarily execute women for alleged, moral behaviour, there's nothing there about establishing power and control and security. That's just Daeshi type excess. So for that person to have been made the face of justice in the new Syria, I think, is worrying. That's one of the worrying things. And
is that Shadi al-Wazai? Is that how you pronounce it?
Sorry?
What's the name of the Justice Minister?
Oh.
We have a note saying Shadi al-Wazai. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. We can,
right. We can just get that clear.
I have a very clear memory of the video clips that of the behaviour.
Because I think that what you're saying is really important, and we need to get the person identified clearly too.
Yeah, we can write and confirm.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, jumping in like that.
No, I don't view anything else to add in terms of that. Whether for HTS you think that justice will be a priority, or whether it will just be offset by trying to hold this country together.
It's a very important and delicate issue for everyone. For HTS, it's delicate and important because there's a lot of public expectation that the people who were involved in, for example, torturing others at Saydnaya prison, for instance, need to be brought to justice. So there is public expectation that whoever is now in charge of Syria needs to hold these people accountable. And at the same time, there's the issue which is broader, which is that of transitional justice. And this is broader than just regime figures who have been involved in transgressions, because obviously Syria had other groups that had also engaged in transgressions. And it would not be a fair process if only one group is held accountable for crimes and not everyone. And so this is very delicate for HTS. The other issue right now is they don't have, as HTS currently, they don't have the capacity as an HTS administration to really govern Syria and bring everyone to justice. And I mean, for that to happen, you need the transition to happen, you need a functioning government, you need to set up an independent judiciary, you need to set up transitional justice processes. There's lots of Syrian initiatives abroad that have already started working on these issues, and who would be best placed to come up with a plan for Syria in that regard. So we're not starting from scratch. There have been people who have been documenting crimes by everyone, people who have used European courts to bring people from all sides to justice who have been involved in transgressions. But all this needs to be, put together in a package, and this is something that, again, Syria needs the international community to help with, and this is one of the other things that we can, I think, concretely help with, this issue of transitional justice in Syria, because it's very important, because without it, I think people are going to be resentful. And at the same time, there might be incidents where people just feel they need to take revenge into their own hands. And this is very dangerous for stability and for social cohesion. And that's another issue I will raise just very briefly, which is that under Assad, Syria was a society in which people were encouraged to mistrust even members of their own family. And so again, this is a society that is now trying to live as one society once more, and for the first time in more than half a century, without this shadow of the regime looming where the walls have ears. And so you're talking generations that have not known anything different, who are now suddenly expected to just trust one another in society, because any functioning society needs to have social trust. And so that is a very important thing also that we can help with, working with civil society to encourage social trust in Syria. And this is not just, as I said, about different sectarian groups, it's even members of one's own family. So there's a lot that can be done, a lot that needs to be done, but I think a lot of opportunities for us to engage positively.
That's very helpful, thank you. Phil?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, perhaps first with Mr. Collis, about Turkey. Turkey obviously shares a very long border with Syria. I think there were diplomatic efforts between Ankara and the Assad regime to re-establish diplomatic relations. The Turkish regime had been supporting the Syrian National Army as well in the north of the country. How important was Turkey in the fall of the Assad regime, in your estimation?
Yeah, great question. Turkey was clearly the most significant external actor in what happened. You just have to look at a map. Idlib, its only international border from the base that HTS broke out of, was with Turkey, and there's been plenty of media coverage of the nature of its relationships with Turkish security forces. I do think that the nature of HTS's relationship with Turkey is different than that of the other factions, the SNA factions that are kind of less disciplined, and more under the direct control of Turkish authorities. They don't seem to be autonomous actors. They're more like hired guns, it looks like, in the SNA, which is the force that has been used against the Kurds in Manbij and so on. HTS and Ahmed Sharat's relationship with Turkey, my sense of it is that it would have been a very important relationship while they were in Idlib, because he would have been highly dependent on that. Now he's in Damascus, they're in Damascus, they've got options, and they have been exercising those options, not least through the engagement with Saudi Arabia, with Jordan, and with other countries. I suspect part of the Saudi engagement with this emerging leadership in Syria is not to leave the field only to the Turks. Mm-hmm. People were.
There's two. May I just say, there's two things that we've had from visits. The first was when we were in Brussels and being told by a Turkish representative there that not to overestimate Turkish influence in Syria politically, and that there was a disconnect and so on, which seems to be similar to what you're saying,
yes.
Which I think is interesting. But then also in the second visit that we've had, being told that the Turkish penetration into Syria has been very much on the commercial front. So there's Turkish stuff, flowing into Syria now in a way that hasn't before, even to the extent that it might be undermining the Syrian economy.
Not sure how much Syrian economy there was to undermine under an artisan scale. I think so to your first point. It's important not to overstate Turkish influence, how deep that is, and I think as this leadership comes to terms with its situation in Damascus, they will find that there were plenty of Arab countries that were looking at Syria whilst the Assad regime was still there and thinking, why is the future of this Arab country being decided by Turkey, Russia and Iran, three non-Arab countries? And so that has changed, and that's an important opportunity to change. And with Iran now out, I think a secondary kind of consequential view by many in the Arab world will be not to let Turkey just fill that gap. Iran's out and Turkey's in. They will want Syria to return to its natural place as an Arab country in the Arab world. The second part of the Turkish engagement is in relation to the north-east and the Kurdish areas. Mm-hmm. And I think this is an area where there's been quite a lot of wishful thinking in the West, in the US and UK, that this problem can somehow be wished away, mitigated away. It seems to me this is a core security question for Turkey, and therefore not one that will be on the table for negotiation. I do not expect them to be ready to tolerate an autonomous Kurdish region on their southern border. They would see it as a fundamental threat to their security. So the question of the unity, the territorial integrity of Syria.
Can I just push back on that slightly? Because arguably there has been an autonomous Kurdish region on their border for the last, entirety of this conflict, operating with, a US security guarantee effectively. So there must be some scope for that to exist alongside Turkey.
I think it's basically completely dependent on the US security guarantee. The alliance with the Kurds over to counter Daesh was necessary, right, and critical, particularly in the first phase. I was the British ambassador in Baghdad when Mosul fell to Daesh, and at that moment Daesh, ISIS were 70 kilometres from Erbil, and working with the Kurds to counter ISIS was essential. What grew out of that, for various reasons, and generals and security people and so on find it very easy to deal with Kurds compared with some of the other people in the region that they might need to engage with. And so the Kurds began to be used as a force for taking territory from ISIS in areas that were not historically Kurdish. And then they began to be used as a force for holding that territory in areas that were not traditionally Kurdish. And the problem there, of course, is that you wind up solving your immediate problem, defeating Daesh, by setting the conditions for the next problem, which is, changing facts on the ground in an unsustainable way. And that is part of what we're having to deal with now, and untangling that in a way that does respect the legitimate rights and aspirations of all people in Syria, including the Kurds, is going to be a big question. It's not the only one, but it's probably the single biggest one, because they are there. But it feels like people are waiting on all sides now in this kind of potential conversation between Turks and the Kurds and Damascus, the authorities there. A lot of people seem to be waiting on what Trump is going to do, to find out whether their American forces will stay or won't. If they don't stay, I imagine that the British forces that are reported to be there will not be able to remain.
Forgive me though, there is also a Kurdish independent, pretty much independent state on the southern border of Turkey, isn't there, in the north of Iraq?
It's not a state.
All right, okay.
I we go back to the.
Right. Let's not get into that. Yeah, right.
Post-Ottoman. Well, but indeed, I think if anybody starts playing with lines, redrawing lines on maps, it will just open a world of pain. The future is to work within the recognised borders, and I don't expect to see an agreement that kind of provides for autonomous regions. I don't think that's going to be acceptable to too many of the parties, not just Turkey but others. But that doesn't exclude the possibility of decentralisation. Syria itself is quite a decentralised country. The way historically the cities and the areas around each of the cities, they are quite distinct, and they have distinct cultures and economies and so on. And so you could imagine a future Syria that would be aligned with how it actually is on the ground, and therefore sustainable. You wouldn't be forcing something unnatural onto the terrain. You could imagine something that is relatively loose, decentralised, but not with autonomy.
Reflecting on those comments about looking forward, I wonder, Dr. Khatib, if you wanted to come in on what Mr. Collis has said about what role, positively or negatively, Turkey could play in light of the Kurdish question with HTS in Syria.
We have to remember that Turkey's main reason for getting involved in Syria in the first place, way back when the conflict began, was because of the Kurdish issue. And that has always been Turkey's priority. Right now, again, we need to remember it's still early days. When something shifts like this, all stakeholders see an opportunity, and everyone will begin with maximalist positions, because that's just how it is in any negotiation. So right now, Turkey and the Kurds are starting with maximalist positions, and HTS is doing the same. Further down the line, there is a possibility for compromise. Ultimately, regardless of the Syrian economy having been devastated, there's going to be reconstruction happening in Syria. This is something that will be very attractive for Turkey to be part of. This provides us as an international community a card to use with Turkey to nudge it towards some sort of compromise with the Kurds. I don't think Arab countries actually want to see a federal Syria, because this is a very sensitive issue for the rest of the Arab world, not just in Syria. Decentralization is a whole other issue. Even that is considered sensitive in certain contexts. However, in Lebanon, for example, right now, with the changes in the government that are happening, the issue of administrative decentralization, which was agreed under the Ta'if Agreement of 1989 and never implemented in Lebanon, is back on the table. So if this takes off in Lebanon, then it makes it more likely for this to be actually implemented in Syria. And this is something that is definitely more than acceptable for the Arab world. We have to remember it was Saudi Arabia that brokered and hosted the Ta'if Agreement that ended the Lebanese civil war. So you can, in a way, use that to imagine what would Saudi Arabia accept in terms of a governance arrangement in Syria. And here I emphasize Saudi Arabia because I think this is now actually the most important regional actor in the Syrian conflict, more important than Turkey. But there will be a balance in Saudi-Turkish relations regarding how the situation in Syria plays out. But we shouldn't forget that Saudi Arabia is actually very influential politically. When it comes to reconstruction, all eyes are on the Gulf when it comes to the Syrian actors. And again, this is another card to push for compromise politically. So I expect, again, it's early days, but I expect there can be a way out. And that way out for the Kurds in Syria is if they say, we are not the same as the PKK. We are striking a different path. We are going to be pragmatic, and we want to engage with everybody. And we will engage with Saudi Arabia and the US and everyone else and accept decentralization. But at the moment, it's not surprising, as I said, that everyone's starting with maximalist demands. But let's not get hung up on where things are right now as publicly expressed, because politics takes time to play out.
We're starting to run out of time. I'm so transfixed by your evidence. It's so very interesting, but I've got to be a bit more disciplined with myself. I think we have 3 large areas of questioning that we'd like to ask you. We've only now got 10 minutes, so maybe just to put that down as a marker. I think you wanted, but do you have another question?
Yeah, I do. I think talking of regional actors, we've seen repeated Israeli military airstrikes in Syria, but also reinforcements of positions in the Golan Heights. Maybe if we go back to yourself, Dr. Khatib, to what extent do you expect Israeli military involvement in Syria to be temporary, or do you see that as being a lasting course of activity?
It's where Syria is not about Syria anymore, because for Israel, this is about Israeli security in general. As we know, after October 7, Israel is determined not to see a repeat of that awful scenario. And at the moment, with the situation as it is in Syria being uncertain, Israel is saying, due to this uncertainty, we need to secure ourselves. So we need to be present in these areas that allow Israel surveillance so that they can maintain their security. The only thing I think that would change this is if Israel feels secure amongst its neighbors. And this is not just about Syria. This is about what plays out in Lebanon as well. This is about relations with, frankly, the Arab world as a whole. And if the Arab world heads in the direction of increased normalization with Israel, then this will translate into then security deals between Syria and Israel. So this is very different from the current context in which Israel is basically there in a de facto kind of way. There's nothing to prevent us further down the line, few years down the line, from seeing a scenario in which there is a new security architecture in the region in which Israel and Syria and Lebanon, kind of have a security agreement that maintains their stability. But for that to happen, we need a few years. But, it's a possibility. And the defeat of Hezbollah militarily in Lebanon paves the way for this kind of scenario to play out. Certainly the change in Syria, where the Iranian role has basically been completely devastated, paves the way for this kind of scenario, because it was the Iran-dominant status quo that had prevented this scenario from happening. So now, with the removal of Iran as a spoiler, to a large degree, there is a possibility to change the security equation in the region.
I'm sorry, just that briefly, I'm aware of the time.
No, it's all right, Relax, it's fine.
Okay. Thank you. I guess Israel did what it did because it can. One can understand, if you're an army, why you want to hold the high ground. It's not yours, but you want to hold it. You can understand why you might want to deal preemptively with stocks of heavy weaponry and so on. This is not helpful to the stability of Syria itself, and perhaps not really to stability and security across the region, which is an Israeli interest as well as an interest to all of the other countries there. So what can we do about it? What can others do about it? I think following up with the leadership in Damascus on their readiness, engaging with them. This is the question about dialogue. Talking not just about abstract concepts, practical cooperation over counter-terrorism. This leadership can be a potentially a counter-terrorism partner against Daesh. There are concerns about the resurgence of ISIS in Homs governorate, in that area south of the Euphrates, that's not under the control of the SDF and the Kurds, and down towards the Jordanian border and the where there's the US.
I think we're going to hear about more in terms of the security situation in the next panel.
Right. So I think the key point is looking to engage with HTS, who have fought ISIS. There is doctrinal difference. The history that Dr. Lina referred to earlier is a distinct history. Even when they had the al-Qaeda roots in al-Nusra Front, they were seen as different. So we know that they're ready to combat Daesh. We should exploit that and see what can be done there. The same thing on weapons of mass destruction. The Syrian regime had chemical weapons. I think some engagement may already be happening. I hope more will happen about what can be done in a negotiated way to deal with that. And that removes security problems for ourselves, but also for other countries in the region, including Israel, and hopefully sets... there are two ways of, at bottom of managing your security. You can do it by force and dominance, or you can do it through negotiation to lower the levels of mutual armament. And the Shara leadership have made clear that they are not looking, they have such big domestic problems that they recognise, and the challenges to deal with Syria, that they are not prioritising these external concerns. So they haven't made that an immediate priority to respond to what Israel has done. But I think they will naturally want to focus on building up security and prosperity inside the country. This is an opportunity to do that in a way that promotes regional security. You don't have Iran playing the spoiler role anymore. And you can build up what begins to look more like the Westphalian state system, which is what countries like Saudi Arabia basically want. They want to see governments in control of countries with borders that can deal with each other in a normal way. Seems to me that's very much in our interest too.
Thank you.
Previously, the Assad regime obviously was reliant to some extent on both Iran and Russia. You've already talked about Iran. I think you said Iran out. But Russia is not out. They still have a military presence in Syria, both the air base and the naval base. Now, when we were in Jordan, it was said that HTS probably had enough on their plate without wishing to pick a fight with Russia. But in the longer term, they cannot be happy that Russia supported Assad and is still harbouring Assad. So where do you see the likely future for Russia's presence in Syria?
I don't.
If at all.
Yeah, if at all, exactly. What does Russia have to offer Syria potentially in the future? It's Russian pilots who murdered Syrian civilians across Aleppo and other cities. I don't think Syrians are going to forget that in a hurry, and nor should they. But from a practical level, looking ahead, it's not obvious to me what Russia has to offer a Syria that's looking to build a future. They're a major oil producer. That's about it. May a Syrian leadership be tempted to sort of let the Russians stay in their naval base a little bit and in the air base a little bit so that they've got something on the table when they talk to the Americans? I don't know, maybe they might think like that. I think that would be a mistake. I don't think it will give them very much leverage with the Americans. I don't see why they would want it themselves. I think they have cracked down. There's been some media reporting on they've kicked out a Russian company that had the contract in Tartus port and have ended that. So let's see where it goes. But I don't expect to see Russia playing a significant role in Syria's future, whether or not they maintain some vestigial presence.
Okay, Abdesam.
Thank you. You've made reference to the Americans a few times throughout. We know that Donald Trump said that it's not their fight initially, but quite recently they've been sharing intelligence with the Syrian new leadership. They've still got a significant amount of troops in the country. How might you think the administration will deal with Syria now? To you, Simon, first.
Thank you. I think there are so many uncertainties. We still don't know exactly who in the Trump administration will be leading on Syria. I've heard a couple of names, but what will they do? What will be the gap between President Trump saying we don't want to be in the Middle East, we have other things to focus on. Successive American administrations have tried to lean out of the Middle East. This is not just a Trump thing. Under Obama and Trump and Biden, successive administrations have tried to be less in the region, and they found that they get drawn back in. For one reason or another. And it may be that is still going to be the case to a certain extent with Trump. I'm sure that the language will be different, and maybe the substance will be different, and the Abraham Accords were a genuine achievement, of course, so we'll have to wait and see. I think whatever they do or don't do will be hugely influential, because even if the European sanctions are lifted, UK sanctions are lifted, there will, because of the extraterritorial element of American sanctions, companies will still hesitate to trade or do business. It will be very difficult. So there has been this 6-month waiver from the US, which has been clear and decisive, and that is actually ahead of where Brussels is and where London is as a temporary measure. I hope we can follow that, but 6 months isn't a long enough timeline for people to take reconstruction decisions. It will allow a surge of humanitarian support and short-term trade, but it won't allow reconstruction, rebuilding infrastructure. So I hope that that the government here, in thinking what can they do about Syria, the conversations with Washington about this will be important, because in a sense, if we and the Europeans can decide to do a whole bunch of stuff, but if the US sanctions remain, nothing that we do will make a difference. If US forces stay or don't stay in the Kurdistan region, that will make a difference to the internal dynamic. So understanding what their vision is and shaping it to the extent we can. It's not going to be easy, but there's no point ignoring it.
Dr. Khatib, do you think that the US would withdraw, given that there's a significant amount of oil resources in the country? Would it be in their interest to withdraw?
It's not just about oil. There's also the issue of
helps.
Iran and the issue of ISIS. One thing that I just published an article about is about the relationship between ISIS and Iran, and how, because ISIS and HTS have historically been rivals for more than a decade, ISIS obviously is not happy that HTS is now the most dominant actor in Syria. Iran at the same time is not happy about having lost basically its influence in Syria either, so there is a pragmatism that brings these two together, Iran and ISIS, which can be a destabilizing factor inside Syria. So for the United States, I think the key thing for us is to think about what the Trump administration wants to do about Iran. And clearly, the focus here is no longer about the nuclear deal, which was obviously the biggest issue under the last administration. Trump made it clear that with Iran, the new strategy will link the nuclear file with the file of ballistic missiles, with the file of Iran's regional interventions, which frankly should have happened a very long time ago, but finally. And this was something that was also emphasized, meaning Iran's destabilization, in the conversation between the Secretary of State in the US, Rubio, and the Saudi foreign minister recently. And so here you have Saudi interests when it comes to Iran's destabilization, coinciding with US interests about Iranian destabilization, coinciding with a government in Syria that will not want to have to deal with Iranian destabilization either. So for that to kind of play out, we need to think about what Washington will do about Iran. And so if the US is serious about tackling the issue of Iranian destabilization, then Syria is definitely a key part of this picture. And again, this takes us back to the issue of Israeli security, because with Iran running around causing destabilization, Israel's under threat. So that is now a red line after October 2023. Things have shifted. What used to be tolerance in Washington and even in Tel Aviv regarding Iran being an influential actor in the Middle East is no longer the case now. So I expect the US is not just going to withdraw and leave the door open for Iran to try, for example, to activate ISIS, because also for Iran, don't forget, in Iraq, for example, it used ISIS to empower the militias that Iran sponsored who were fighting ISIS. And Iran wants to show that it is needed in the fight against ISIS. So it is in Iran's interest for ISIS to kind of be active again. The US is obviously aware of all this. So this is why we're seeing the sharing of intelligence with HTS, because the situation can spiral out of control. So I think we should not be myopic and think long term and kind of big picture when it comes to how the US will handle Syria, and I expect it will handle it through this bigger prism.
Just a very quick follow-up question. So do you think HTS will welcome the support from America? How is their support being received? So what's the flip side to this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the sharing of intelligence will be both ways. The US has alerted the current administration in Damascus about, for example, the planned attack that did not happen.
Sayyidah Zainab.
Yes, and Sayyidah Zainab in Damascus. And equally, there will be sharing of intelligence from the field in Syria with the US, because, as I said, this is a shared concern, and it has to do with Israeli security as well. And one thing I will add here about Israel is that Ahmad al-Shara did say that we are not interested in starting war with Israel. That's not what this administration wants to do. And when it comes to Russia, again, very quickly, he also said that they view the relationship with Russia as a long-term strategic one. And so for me, this means, again, looking at how Saudi Arabia despite its close relationship with the US, maintained relations with Russia at the same time. I think this is the formula that will also play out in Syria, in the sense that this is going to be an administration that knows that it's in its best interest to remain on friendly terms with everyone and not place itself in any one particular camp. And so I think we're seeing a lot of pragmatism at play that again, for me, is something to work with.
If I may, just on one point about...
Very quickly, because we're definitely getting behind.
Russia and Saudi Arabia, it's actually a very thin relationship, with the exception of one big thing, which is the coordination over oil production. It's the one thing that Riyadh needs to coordinate with Russia about the OPEC Plus. The plus in OPEC Plus is Russia. Okay. But beyond that, it's a thin relationship. There just isn't much to offer. And I think that would be the same for Syria in the end, long term.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we say keeping relations with everyone, not with the same intensity or the same depth. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Chair. I want to return us to UK policy. We've been right the way around the region, and we touched on UK policy a little bit earlier. I think you both agreed that sanctions should have been lifted against Syria by the UK. So could you just, and we have 2 minutes left really, just give us a little outline of your assessment of UK policy towards Syria, what's been done well, and perhaps what more should have been done.
So I can understand why a natural instinct here might be to be cautious, because there are so many uncertainties, and the politics of it are difficult.
Should we reopen the embassy?
It's time to be bold. There is nothing to lose from being bold, from dropping the sanctions, reopen the embassy, the engagement. It's doing more quickly along the lines that are already happening. I'm not suggesting...
Earlier on you said you lift the sanctions because you can reapply them. Well, wouldn't that same logic apply to considering HTS to be a terrorist organisation?
Yeah, we should... build on the engagement that is already happening with them. We don't need to remove the designation of HTS. HTS, by its own lights, is preparing to dissolve itself. You know, won't exist anymore. There will be decisions about the individuals who've been designated, but the organisation, I think, it will become a morph into a national body, not. It won't exist as HTS any longer. Ahmed Shara has been quite clear about that. So lifting the sanctions, engaging in a security dialogue, a counter-terrorist dialogue, engaging in a political dialogue that, whilst understanding that in the end this will be Syrian decisions, nudges where possible on the National Convention, nudges things in the right direction about
also,
conclusion and winning.
We talked earlier about the importance of governance, and I always think the UK is in a special place in terms of what it can do to support countries developing their governance models. Could we do that better if we had the embassy there and we had...
Yes, of course. Although, just from a practical point of view, the prerequisite for any kind of governance is a minimum of security. Mm-hmm. Without there being... And then understanding what that is going to look like. It's not going to be perfect. For HTS to provide security across the country, without which nothing else can happen. Mm. So I think just being respectful of that as a practical matter and going along with it without conceding that then allows Ahmed Shara and his team to treat the National Convention, the National Dialogue process, as one where they decide what the minority communities will be, what role they will have. They're going to have to be around the table.
1 minute.
Yeah.
We've got about a minute left.
Word, yeah. But could you make it brief, please?
I mean, I'm not sure I have much to add, to be honest, in terms of policy. I've been talking about engagement, working with civil society, working on transitional justice, talking to our Gulf friends, Israeli security is something to bear in mind. You know, I don't know what else.
Is it important for the UK to be bold because of the geopolitical considerations that Russia and other countries will want to gain influence in
Well,
Syria?
as you know, there is no such thing as a vacuum in international relations. If we're not there, someone else will occupy that space, which is what happened with Russia in 2015. And so we can't afford for that scenario to be repeated.
Thank you very much.
Can I thank you very much indeed for the time that you've given us. It's been such an interesting session. What I intend to do is to have a 2-minute break so that we can all recover before we get into the next one, which I suspect will also be quite an interesting and intense session. But thank you all very much for your time today. And if there is anything that we've missed out or anything else that you think that we should know about, please do write in as well. We would appreciate that as well. You can give written evidence as well as oral evidence. Thank you so much. We're now going to begin the second session of oral evidence on the situation in Syria. I wondered if our three witnesses might introduce themselves. Perhaps if we begin with Professor Harmony Toros.
Hello. So I'm Harmony Toros. I'm a professor in politics and international relations at the University of Reading, and I have been following the question of detainees in the various detention centres, camps and prisons in northeast Syria for the last 5 years now.
Very good.
So my name is Richard Barrett, and I was dealing with various security issues until I was asked by the Secretary General to go to New York to help with the Security Council sanctions regime on al-Qaeda and Taliban, as it was then, al-Qaeda and Daesh, as it is known now.
Mr. Jordan.
My name is Paul Jordan. I'm a senior advisor working on international and national security, and the stuff here is relating to my work at the European Institute of Peace, where I head work in responding to security crises, of which violent extremism is one.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming before this committee. I wonder if I might kick off, perhaps, by asking some questions about the Islamic State in Syria. And might I ask Mr. Barrett, perhaps first, so how serious is the threat posed by Islamic State in Syria today? And is it a threat to the UK?
Well, I think the Islamic State reckons that it's got a good opportunity because it's been contained so far by, of course, CENTCOM in conjunction with the SDF. The SDF, of course, under increased threat from Turkey and now finding it harder and harder to insert itself in the new government in Syria in a way that preserves its identity and helps its aspirations towards increasing the sort of Kurdish-controlled area that already exists in Iraq. And ISIS have had something of a resurgence anyway over the last year or 18 months because they've been really knocked back by CENTCOM and other forces, including the Iraqis, and including, of course, the Russians and Iranians, who are no longer now there to help that fight, and the Syrian army. But they probably have about 2,000-3,000 fighters, active fighters. That's a long way down from what they had in say 2019, when they probably had about 15,000 fighters. But still, you can do a lot of damage with 3,000 fighters, and they see a big opportunity to increase their numbers. But from the 9,000 Islamic State prisoners which are under SDF control at the moment, because there's about 22 prisons, I think the SDF have these people in. CENTCOM have been trying to help them improve the security. Remember, there was a big prison break in 2019, I believe, where about 500 people got killed, prison guards and prisoners alike. And so the Islamic State see these 9,000 still in prison as ones that they could liberate and have joined their ranks, because obviously the prisoners would have nowhere else to go. And they've revived what they call the Breaking the Walls campaign, which they initiated in Iraq during the Iraq war there. And they managed to liberate a lot of prisoners who then were able to join al-Qaeda in Iraq, as it was, to fight and increase their dominance in their areas. I don't know how long you want me to go on talking about Islamic State. And
I think that it's interesting to hear when we were told in 2019 that they'd been defeated, that they're now they've now got a campaign of breaking the walls and trying to get the 9,000 within the walls out.
Yeah.
I think it's that's sort of important for people perhaps to hear if that is what's happening. Well, but I think that you also touched on the other side of it, which is the relationship with the Syrian democratic forces and how strong they are.
Yeah. Well, the Syrian Democratic Forces, of course, are under considerable threat because they have not been able to negotiate with HTS, with the new as it were, de facto government in Damascus, to preserve their identity. I mean, HTS have offered them, along with, I think there's 67 other armed groups they've been negotiating with, to allow the SDF members to come into the new Syrian army. But the SDF, I think, as Simon Collis was saying, have insisted that they remain as a bloc and remain deployed in northeast Syria, which, of course, the HTS can't accept because that would, look as though it's a potentially separatist group within Syria, but also the Turks, of course, wouldn't accept that at all. And Turkey is probably, apart from the United States, the main player in all this in the short term. So ISIS...
the United States being a main player, and since you're referring to the United States in this area being a major player, so what difference has there been in the area as a result of the elections of Donald Trump?
We don't know. I mean, and that is the big question. What will happen? The SDF, I think, are hoping that CENTCOM will be allowed to stay, that they'll manage to keep their 2,000 troops and their air support and so on, and therefore see SDF as an essential partner in the continuing fight against the Islamic State. But although General Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, has been very busy in trying to negotiate things between SDF, HTS, the Turks, and everybody else, he hasn't actually managed to come up with anything which is concrete. And of course, he doesn't know what Trump and Hegseth are going to tell him to do, because Trump's isolationist policy would tend to make us think that he probably would want to withdraw those troops, or at least have as little to do with the future of Syria as possible. So,
is there not also been a change in terms of funding in the area?
Yes, well, that's right. I mean, USAID, as you've seen just now, has been, all their funding of foreign initiatives from all over the world has been suspended for the time being, and Trump will no doubt say, well, who benefits from all this? They should pay. But I think that, I don't mean to be rude to the US president.
No, of course you don't.
But these issues are really, really complicated, of course, as the previous panel was explaining. And the Turkish role, Erdogan, for example, who has very strong ideas of Turkish power, Turkish regional power, and the sort of resurgence of the Ottoman Empire, in a way, in his grandest moments, remembers how he dealt with President Trump in the past. At the end of President Trump's first term, Erdogan reckoned he'd got one over him and managed to persuade him that he should leave this area to the Turks and not get further involved. And I think Erdogan is quite confident that he can persuade Trump that this is not your battle. You can get out of here, we'll look after it, and we'll come to some arrangement with the HTS in order to be able to deal with the Islamic State prisoners and the Islamic State threat as well. You've got air power, but we've got airplanes too, type of thing. But in fact, the reality is that if the Turks were to take part in the battle or take over the CENTCOM role in the battle against Islamic State, I think that would be a real challenge to the new government in Damascus that they would find hard to deal with. And I don't think it would be a satisfactory answer for anybody.
And Mr. Jordan, you were indicating you wanted to say something.
Just wanted to come in on the last point regards to what difference it would make, and particularly the funding. So the US, as you're probably all aware, the State Department has put an embargo on all of their funded programs, one of which is the camps. So there's an organisation called Bluemont that run Al-Hol and Al-Roj, which are the two main camps, humanitarian camps, more like big detention facilities, really. And what that led to was, in the last few days, basically nothing being delivered within the camps. So no NGOs were able to go in. There was no camp administration, very little security, wasn't food delivered, etc., etc. So it had an immediate impact on the people on the ground, on the safety, on the security, and everything else. I've been working since 2019 on the camps, the prisons, and the issue of repatriations, basically helping countries with their repatriations, looking at getting people back to their countries of origin. a lot of our work is funded by the US. We've got the same thing. The US as well have a lot of partnerships with countries in terms of repatriation. Again, that stopped immediately. So in terms of a kind of immediate impact, I've never seen anything as significant as this before.
Who's paying the guards?
So again, US, that will come from the US. Now, today I've heard that Bluemont, who are running the camps, are back in the camps. So I would think that something has been done where maybe the coalition have taken over or something. But again, it's kind of everyone is waiting to see what will happen. So it's really in limbo around what's going to happen with the camps in the sort of short to medium term, whilst this 3 to 4 month decision is made. From the
Just so I've got it clear, so the Americans were paying the guards at these camps.
So
they've withdrawn the funding, and so there's the money for food wasn't going in, the money to pay the guards wasn't happening.
So the whole camp administration is basically shared between an organisation called Bluemont and the Kurdish administration, of which the US will be funding the vast majority of that.
Right.
So again, the entirety of the camps and how they work are down to that funding.
And so what's happened since?
I mean, so for the last couple of days, there was basically nothing. Nothing was happening at the camps. A number of the NGOs that provide humanitarian support are also get their funding via US, so they had to withdraw anyway. But no others could go in because of the level of safety and security and because there was no administration. Apparently today...
Are these the camps with the men in, or are these the camps with the women in too?
So when I talk about camps, this is... you have al-Hol, which is the biggest one, which has an annex, which is third country nationals. So that's around about 55 countries from everywhere apart from Iraq and Syria. Okay, and that is around about 6,000 people, something like that, purely women and children. The other side of al-Hol are women, children and men, but men not thought to be part of ISIS, and it's generally in family units. That's purely Syrian and Iraqi, and now it's around about 20, 30,000, around about those sorts of numbers left there. And those are just camps. The prisons are separate, but again, there will be US funding to the prisons. And then there are also detention facilities for young males and boys.
But in the last but suddenly you're now saying that the latest news is that that someone seems to be funding it again.
Yeah, as literally during the first session, I got an update because obviously we have teams on the ground who haven't been able to do anything the last couple of days, who said today it looks like it's the administration are back, but there is just, no one really knows what's going on and how long that's going to be fixed for.
I don't mean to ask a flippant question, but I mean, who do you think might be funding them again?
So I guess it would probably be the coalition.
Coalition is who?
The coalition again to defeat Daesh. So this was the coalition that was formed to partner with the Kurds, which it's basically got a military part and a political part. A lot of funding from the US, UK funds it, European countries. I think it's around 27 countries are part of it in total. But most of the funding and the kind of grunt work, if you like, is US, UK and some Western European countries.
Right, thank you.
I could just mention that both Turkey and HTS have offered to take over running these camps. And they would be relying to a certain extent on other people helping them fund it, but they will have their own sources of income, or they will claim to, and that may encourage the Americans, of course, to feel, okay, well, we can get out.
Thank you. Okay, John.
I just have a quick question, which I think is probably for Mr. Barrett. Well, I welcome any thoughts. Obviously, there's been cheering at the fall of the Assad regime, and there's also a recognition of the threat which ISIS poses. But can I just ask what your assessment of HTS is? Because previously they have been designated as terrorism, but now they are suggesting that they are reformed characters, if you like. To what extent should we accept that, or should we still treat them with considerable caution?
I think the HTS argument that they're just nationalists, certainly anti-Assad, certainly insurgents, but not in any way interested in attacking anybody outside Syria. I think that can be taken more or less at face value based on their track record. And they've been, yes, if you look at Ahmed al-Shara, he went to Iraq and in 2003 joined al-Qaeda in Iraq. What he did, he was 20 at the time, so, he must have done something, but maybe not a hell of a lot before he was banged up by the Americans. And, of course, in the camps that the Americans were running, where he was from, I think, about 2003, 2006, he met all those people like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and all those other, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and all those other people who went on to join al-Qaeda in Iraq. And he went with them to do that, but it was quite shortly after the start of the Syrian revolution that he went over to Syria with 8 or 9 other people from al-Qaeda in Iraq, rather against Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's wishes, to start what was called then Jabhat al-Nusra, which was an al-Qaeda affiliate. But again, all these labels are, they're easy to stick on and quite easy to peel off in a way, because everybody was looking for some sort of purchase, some sort of reason that people would come and join them. There was great competition, if you like. And Ahmed al-Shara made clear from the start, I think, that his ambition was to change the regime in Syria, not to do anything even in Iraq particularly, and certainly not abroad. And more recently, since 2020 anyway, he's been trying to make overtures to the Americans and sharing intelligence and stuff like that. And the Americans eventually took him up on that, and of course in the recent couple of years have been finding and killing or otherwise encouraging HTS to imprison various al-Qaeda leaders and Islamic State fighters who turned up in Idlib or in other areas where the HTS had some control. And even, if I may add, recently, a couple of weeks ago, in fact, in Damascus, based on some American intelligence, the HTS arrested a cell of 4 Islamic State fighters who were about to, they're really very ready to attack Shia shrines near Damascus. So, that's quite significant track record. And, of course, Islamic State refer to them as apostates and takfiris, and they call them jihadists turned politicians, which I don't know if it's worse to be called a jihadist or a politician.
Terrible accusation.
But anyway, and in Islamic State language, that I guess is the wrong direction. But I think the HTS is very much in the other direction of jihadists turned politicians to the better.
Thank you.
I'm interested in just sort of extrapolating a little bit further on this sort of, because obviously we're going to talk about Islamic State and foreign fighters around Islamic State, and but obviously HTS also has had foreign fighters within its ranks, and some of those are from Uyghurs from the East Turkestan Islamic movement and elsewhere, and while HTS, as it becomes as it morphs into the state of Syria, has looked to incorporate some of those fighters into the new military, what I'm interested to know is whether or not, Islamic State aside, from within HTS, we're going to see an outflux of foreign fighters returning to either home or other operating theatres, and whether or not we should have any concerns around that.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. So far, HTS have, much to the annoyance of their Syrian colleagues, put some of these foreign fighters in positions of authority, particularly in the northwest, where they're well known, as a way to sort of calm them down, keep them within the tent and so on. Maybe also they have some ability at administration, because after all, HTS have been essentially providing governance in that area for a long time now, and doing it relatively well, I would say. But yes, there's that risk of people going outside who could claim to have come from an HTS route. But HTS, you can see since the beginning of December how much activity HTS has engaged with other states, including, of course, Anne Snow, going from Foreign Office here. But it's been really intense, particularly with Turkey, but with the European Union, with the Americans, with anyone who wants to go, pretty much, So I think one of the subjects on the agenda will very much have been, well, how many of our nationals might you have, or how many members might you have who might come and threaten our security? And I think HTS response has been, well, these are the people who we have. We don't think they're going to be a threat to you, but let's talk about it. Let's manage it together. And I think this will come back also with their offer to take over the camps and prisons in North citizens. And one of the issues that the government here will have to face is what to do with them as the situation becomes more and more fragile.
Sorry, I talked too much. My colleagues speak.
Thank you. So I've got a question for Paul. You referenced earlier the camps and people's experiences there. To what extent are the conditions like in the detention camps?
I mean, to say dreadful is putting it mildly, to be honest, particularly at the moment. I haven't been for a little bit now. Last year was the last time I went. But as I say, I've got a team on the ground that's there sort of 24/7, and since 2019 I've been going pretty regularly. It used to be every couple of months or so. There isn't enough food. The sanitation facilities are poor. There's nowhere near enough medical facilities. The annex where the third country nationals are in al-Hol, basically what happened there was because the Kurds saw them as the more dangerous of those two communities, one being the Iraqis and Syrians, who are largely people who fled, and those that had joined Islamic State from other countries were seen as being part of Islamic State and therefore a higher threat. So they just kind of put them in an area and closed the door, and then didn't let anyone in or out of that. And it's been like that for a long time now, since the end of 2019. There's never been enough funding for it to get to an appropriate level. There's never been enough competency of those managing it, and that's largely because it's been under Kurdish control. The UN haven't been able to step in because it's not a state. So there's been a kind of hodgepodge of different actors, largely Kurdish administration. Initially, the Kurds saw this as something they could use for leverage, so they saw it as a good opportunity to be able to speak to different states, to act as a state on the international stage, and that made repatriations difficult. And a lot of the work I was doing initially, particularly with European states, was trying to manage that relationship between the Kurds and the states that wanted to repatriate. Repatriation really is the only solution, and that's why the US have been pushing it for a long time. That's why now pretty much all European states have repatriated all of those that they've been able to. There are some Europeans left, but a lot of those are the kind of refuseniks, the ones that are saying, I'm not going to come back. Roj is slightly better, but again, conditions have been going down and down. Roj is much, much smaller. That's only a couple of thousand as compared to tens of thousands in al-Hol. Al-Hol at its highest was nearly 90,000 people, and around about 12 to 15,000 in the annex.
What's the experience like for children and women?
Children, it is indescribable. It really is. It's terrible. You know.
Longest that someone's lived there as a child?
Since 2019. You know, they stay in there. What happens? The only time that a child will move is either they are repatriated, so their country comes to collect them, or for the boys, when they get to around about 13, to stop the sexual violence, the enforced rape that happens a lot, they are moved to a detention facility. So they're separated from their mums, taken to a detention facility, which is just young boys. When they get too full, then they go into the prisons. What's happened fairly recently, so a few months ago, was some of the boys were taken back into the camps or into al-Hol from the detention facilities, they were immediately married by the women inside the annex. That was largely North African women who that was, but there's a very significant radical element. It's an incredibly radicalizing place. Most of the education, if you can call it that, within the annex is carried out by radicalized women who are just forcing a kind of Islamic State propaganda on the kids. There's no activities for the kids, nothing to play with. You know, they create sort of toy guns and stuff. Any support that tries to go into the annex, often people are kind of stoned because, again, the kids are just taught to be radical towards other people. So it's a very, very grim existence.
And is this likely to get worse?
Absolutely, yeah. So 2024 was the worst year for funding for Syria as a whole. So it was around about half of the modal average across from sort of 2016 to 2023. So it's 1.6 billion, I think, for the whole of Syria, of which al-Hol camp, you know, will be right down the bottom of that list. Nowhere near enough. WHO, MSF, and all of the humanitarian organisations have said that it's a catastrophe in terms of medication, in terms of supplies, in terms of sanitation, everything else. You know, the various conflicts that have taken donors' attention and money away have just meant that the conditions will get worse. This, you know, what happened with the US funding, again, will just start not only to reduce capacity to deliver support within the camps, but then also that has an effect on those within the camps. It will increase violence. It's already a very violent place. It will increase distrust, animosity, you know, so you've got a bad situation only going one direction.
Thank you. Could I just briefly come in on that? I think it's important to note that Fionnuala Ní Eoláin, who was there with her team in 2023, she concluded that the treatment of children there amounts to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, right?
May I just ask who Fionnuala is?
She was a special rapporteur for counter-terrorism and human rights, and she led a team of international lawyers, and she visited the camps and she visited the detention centres and essentially concluded that this amounts to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment of children, and a cradle-to-grave system for these children that essentially are born into camps and then graduate into detention centres and then graduate into prisons and then potentially die because they have large amounts of tuberculosis in the prisons. Yeah. So it's a sort of a pipeline of degradation and inhumanity that these children are exposed to.
There is. I mean, I hear what you said about I mean, I know that there are still British women and children in these camps, yeah. And I have a constituent of dual nationality, and I think she was offered a deal whereby she had to stay, but British authorities would take her children back to the UK. And one of them has died, and she has one child left, and is still trying to come back into the UK. But there's been times when the family have seen video of her, and she's not been able to stand up. I mean, the account that you give seems to be consistent with the accounts that the family give me of the conditions in which she lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you know, from the perspective of the Kurds, you know, they had literally just finished this conflict, this battle, this war with the Islamic State, and then they have all of these people which they see as, you know, their opponents in this battle, which they now have to look after. They've never run a camp of this size. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have the finances. They don't have the wherewithal. They don't have anything. So they're starting from such a low starting point that to be able to get to even, you know, the ability of just it ticking along was just too far for them, you know, and the amount of money that would be needed and the amount of influx of expertise to be able to get it to a standard, it's just never going to happen. It's just never going to happen.
So my constituent was 17 when she was... some would say trafficked, some would not, but you know, she was a child, and when she went out to Syria to marry a fighter. What is the youngest age of a girl that you've heard of who's gone from a country to another in order to marry a fighter? How young do we talk?
So I've certainly heard of 10 and 11-year-olds, some very young teens as well. There is definitely cases of trafficking. You know, there is no doubt in my mind at all. And you ask anyone that's actually been there and dealt with these people, it's absolutely true. You know, it smacks you in the face. Even the Kurds, you know, if you speaking to the SDF and the administration right at the start of it, and they're kind of, you know, sort of sticking a finger in the air, okay, this is what we think are the different women within the annex. They suggested that they think around about 10 to 20% were trafficked, okay, were total victims. And they would definitely err on the side of caution. You know, they're not particular fans of anyone in there. But there is certainly a sizable amount who are trafficked. There is definitely, on the other end, some deeply radicalised women and some women who have no doubt completed some heinous crimes. But they will not answer for those crimes in the camps. At the moment, they are just arbitrarily detained, so there's no justice for the victims. You know, the victims are all around where the camp is. Everyone was immediately affected by ISIS and their crimes there. There's no justice for them, so there's no chance of, you know, getting through this. And again, if we're just swapping the management of the camp, again, there's no progress of this. You know, there needs to be some form of justice for those at that end. And again, from the Kurdish perspective and from my experience, I would say you've got kind of two ends, 10 to 20% at each end, one of which were total victims, one of which, you know, heinous and deeply radicalised, and then you have a very large centre of which, you know, they could be either end. And part of what I've been doing is kind of establishing, okay, whereabouts are these people on this, and then trying to move people so they can be repatriated and then be dealt with within their countries, because that's the only solution for this.
Blair.
You mentioned about the sort of radicalising education that kids are getting in the camps. We also have reports of child soldiers essentially being taught how to fight, taught to be suicide bombers as well. Feels a bit like the war on terror, in inverted commas, has gone from being a situation where we attack terrorist training camps to where the international community seems to be essentially creating one there at the moment. Can you say a little bit about that side of things in terms of how the sort of dangerous skills that these young people are being taught?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, if you look at again, al-Hol, particularly on the Iraqi and Syrian side, definitely had infiltration of quite serious ISIS members. You know, it had cells operating in the camp because you had, you know, at its peak, 80,000 people in there, you know, and that was men, women and children. So you had basically criminal gangs operating within the camps. Lots of murders, lots of smuggling of weapons, and the Kurds and the SDF would do military operations sort of periodically and just bring in caches of weapons, discover a load of dead bodies, you know, maybe arrest themselves, but again they would be able to build back up again. In the annex, the kind of immediate threat in terms of, you know, threat to the security forces is slightly less because they've left them, but there is definitely a radicalising and radicalised approach whereby the most radical women run at that annex, and they have to, because if you step out of line, you will be killed. As simple as that. So anyone who isn't adopting those radical processes, their life is in immediate danger. So, you know, even if you are not that way, you're damn sure going to pretend that you are. And they are definitely looking at perpetuating the violence. You know, they had celebrations when the Taliban took over. They had celebrations with regards to Gaza because they saw these as opportunities for extremist groups to kind of fight back. And they have been preaching that and have been preaching, that they will be rescued by the Islamic State and to prepare themselves. And part of that is conditioning the young for that.
Is there any effective, I suspect given earlier on you were talking about a failure to feed and provide basic medical support, is there any effective international interventions to combat the radicalisation within the camps?
No, there's bits and pieces that happen in the Iraqi and Syrian side in al-Hol. A lot of that is around sort of strategic communications, so messaging to people. Within Roj, it's slightly better. We did a lot of work with the children in Roj because Roj is a much smaller camp, a couple of thousand people. It's better organised, so that the tents actually have a physicality to them. So they've got like a little stone outline which they can put them in. There's a lot more security. It's much easier to manage. So in Roj,
why are some people in al-Roj and some in al-Hol?
So that really was a little bit of dint of...
That's the luck of the draw?
Yeah, pretty much. What happened at certain stages, so quite a lot with some of the repatriations is people get moved to Roj first before they're then repatriating because it's just a little bit easier to take people out of Roj than it is taking them out of Hol. Sometimes some countries have been able to negotiate with the Kurds and say, can we have some people moved across to Roj? But it really is what happened. The reason why al-Hol so many...
Just for those who might be watching and interested in this, if you're in al-Roj doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be repatriated.
Correct. No. They both are facilities to hold the people, basically. Yeah. The reason why al-Hol had such an influx was the fall of Baghouz. Baghouz was the last standout of the Islamic State. That was where basically everyone went through. They were defeated, territorial defeat there. Everyone flooded out of that very small town, and al-Hol is very close to it. So it was just a case of what happened was the Kurds, the men, okay, you're going on the back of a van to prison, women and children, in you go, shut the gate, keep them in
there. Finally, Chair, can I just ask about, obviously the UK is funding some of these camps and prisons. Are the inmates aware of that, and does that increase the risk to the UK from these individuals?
Of the UK funding? Mm-hmm. I don't think it would increase the risk. I think that what there would be, the only thing, I don't think they'd be too aware of UK funding. Mm-hmm. There isn't the sort of classic, delivered with UK aid.
Not Union flag on the outside of the prison. No.
But I guess, the only thing would be the British citizens would perhaps see it as a bit of a hypocrisy of the funding when there is such a firm position on repatriations. And I think that's a definite area where the UK has been kind of out alone in a very small group, a very negative group.
So to help us with that.
Yes.
So are all the Americans now back?
There are some Americans that remain, and again with pretty much every country apart from I know that Kosovo repatriated and have all of their citizens. Yes. There are other countries that have attempted to repatriate all of their citizens. But to give you an example, when I started in 2019, I started with 11 European countries, the UK and the EU as a kind of small group talking about this. And at that point in time, all of them said, no, we're not repatriating. They don't care, we're not doing anything about it. Now, all of that group, apart from the UK, has lent into repatriations. And pretty much certainly all Western European countries, Northern European countries, a lot of Southern European countries as well, Even Eastern European, including Russians, a lot of Russians have been repatriated, a lot of Ukrainians have been repatriated, have taken the step to go, we will repatriate, and really it's only been those who've refused repatriation. Okay, so I think there's, a couple of Germans, maybe some French, etc. And in general, those are what we deem difficult cases, whereby they've said, okay, no, I'm not being repatriated, and then they're not going to be rendered. In those cases, generally what it is either the mother is very radicalised, one of those ones I've talked about.
Are we talking just about the women, or are we talking about women and men?
So this is just about the women.
Right.
This is just about
That's
the women.
really clear. Yeah.
Women and children, basically. They're either deeply radicalised or they have concerns around their children, because it's very likely when they get back, a lot of countries are looking to prosecute, which is absolutely right, no problem with that at all. And so there has to be some sort of negotiation around, okay, what happens with the children? And some have said, no, I'm not happy with that. There have been, people, women from Germany, from Sweden, from others who have been prosecuted. So again, I think that this prosecution argument isn't really a good one that can hold any weight. With regards to the men, at the moment, there's not been any repatriations really of the men in general. Again, apart from Kosovo did. But that's kind of, for us, the next thing to look at.
The American men are still there then?
The American men, yes. Again, in terms of Western Europeans, Americans, Canadians, there's not a great deal, there's not a lot that are done. Something has to be done about them. That's what we're kind of working with, and what I'm working with various different states to try and look at next. I think the other thing, kind of going back to the US piece, I think it's important to recognise that the chances of the US putting people on planes and just sending them back to their countries of origin have gone up significantly with the new administration. That's definitely something that could happen. It's always been something that could happen, but I think now the chances of that have gone up significantly. So again, what I've been telling states for the last 12 months, and certainly with the sort of very far quickly shifting sands in Syria, is people are coming back whether you like it or not, and it's just up to you whether you control that or whether you have to deal with it when they're back.
To be fair,
well, I was just about to go to Professor Toros. May I take her first and then come to you, if that's all right? I'm sorry, she just indicated earlier I was going to come back.
No, I think it's important to note that most children are under the age of 10, right? Certainly that is the case with the British nationals that we know of. So although there is this worry and this legitimate concern of the radicalisation of older children, a lot of the children are very small, right? So there are very small children who, from my understanding, engage in activities. There has been some level of informal primary education. There's been an attempt to do some level of formal primary education, but they will. They'll build, I'm sure, toy guns, but they'll also try and build chess pieces, right? So I think it's important to sort of remember that some of these children are just children, and there's a danger of having an imaginary around these children that is not, I think, not reflected in the majority of them. But do you want me to go on to the question of the repatriation, or?
I think yes.
Yes.
Well, should we take Mr. Barrett and then come back?
Sorry, Richard, do you want to come in?
well, I was just going to say, just to be fair, or to be clear, UK has brought back some women and children, very few. I think last year there was one woman and 5 children or something, and then in 2023 there were about 3 women and
I think it was
4
8
children.
in total, something like 7 or 8.
Yeah, so it is possible. That's what I'm trying to say. But
Yes, and I understand. The complicating factor is that they're dual nationals. Has been the issue, hasn't it? Sorry, ma'am. Yes.
So specifically on the repatriation, there's a tracker of these repatriations, and the UK seems to have repatriated in total 21 people, 18 of them children and three of them women. But if you compare that, to Kosovo, Kosovo's 104, Kyrgyzstan is 454. Like the scale is quite. There's a very, very, very different scale in terms of the repatriation. And to sort of follow up on what Paul was saying, the UK does sit as an outlier here in terms of its policy, in terms of refusing repatriation. And there are specific cases. There was a recent case where a woman had, in appeal, she had her citizenship restored and asked to come back. And the Kurdish authorities essentially said, we need the UK to say she can come back, and the UK government refused to do so. So I think there's a variety of sort of blockages that have taken place at the UK level.
I think we have a couple more questions around this, and then I'll come back to you, Phil, if I might. I think we seem to be sort of
an area.
Yes,
well,
an area.
I guess just sort of extrapolating out on that in terms of the UK's responsibility in this area and what the drivers are for saying no. Is our rationale an outlier when we're saying no, or is it the same logic that other countries are applying? And
I mean, the rationale was a rationale of, to a certain degree, of security. There was concern about the return of these individuals who may have sort of, even if they left as minors, there was the concern that they had been radicalized, that they had engaged in violence, that they were a threat, and there was the concern that they would not be, because these crimes were committed abroad in places where evidence was difficult to gather, that the prosecutions would be difficult. I think there was a very, very strong element of not wanting to engage in a policy that was seen as deeply unpopular and something that they could, pay a political cost, right? And so I think there's a strong element of that. That we came 2 years ago and we said, this is a pressing issue. The danger is that northeast Syria will not remain as it is, that the situation on the ground will change, and that will make the question even more pressing, and that's exactly where we are today, right? We are in a situation where, in terms of humanitarian aspects, in terms of legal aspects, and in terms of security aspects, this question is that much more pressing than it was 2 years ago, because as Paul was saying, we have examples in other countries of managed multi-agency successful prosecution of women. So there was 2 women were sentenced in Norway this weekend, actually. 2 returnees were sentenced in Norway this weekend to 4 years and 2 years in prison for being members of a terrorist organization. So the successful prosecution of people who are deemed to have carried out crimes or joined a terrorist organization give credence to the argument that if men were repatriated, this would be possible as well, right?
And I suppose the issue here goes back to your point about the sort of what's the threshold for proving your ability to evidence, that they've committed a crime, because it goes back to this political will issue of, if you brought somebody back who, having just spent the better part of a decade being radicalised in a Syrian prison, whether they went in as a radical or not, you bring them back and suddenly you can't prove or you can't pass the bar of evidence required to prove that they should be incarcerated in the UK, all you've now got is somebody who's extremely radical and free in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 questions there. One is that, as Paul was arguing, most likely these people, if these prisons or these detention camps fall apart, and that is a possibility, right? This is a genuine possibility, that this return will happen anyway, but just in an unmanaged, uncontrolled way. And the second argument is that this country has a very, very elaborate counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism system, right? That includes what used to be called control orders and now are TPIMs, and that allow for cases where where there is not the evidence needed for successful prosecutions are put in orders that allow the state to control their activities.
Or you just strip them of their citizenship and pretend this is now somebody else's problem somewhere else in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty with that is, so we have situation. The UK has stripped the citizenship of a lot of, certainly of a lot of women, and we assume of a lot of men, but we do not actually know. But their children are British citizens, right? So you find yourself in a situation where you have the obligation of repatriating British citizens who are held in conditions that are cruel, inhuman, and degrading. Yet, having stripped the parent of the citizenship, you are then saying, well, it isn't. You would have to convince someone that it is not in the best interest of the child to stay with the only parent they have been with for the past 5 years. So I think stripping of citizenship makes things more complicated rather than simplifying the situation.
I think as well with that from a policy perspective, that's all well and good to say, okay, well, from a security perspective, it kind of removes the problem for us. But it's incredibly isolationist, and in a kind of a horizon where our ties to the US might not be as obvious or distinct, and we might need other partners. We're outside of the EU now, and we need European security partners and others. If we are very isolationist on this security policy, then what will happen, and what has happened along this piece, is countries will look at the UK and say, well, can we really rely on them to be a decent security partner that holds themselves to the standards they supposedly hold themselves?
Also, if we want countries to take foreign nationals in Britain back, we have to accept that we have to take British nationals in foreign countries back. That is the quid pro quo.
Absolutely.
It's a legal obligation, of course, as well. But if I could just broaden it out a little bit to what you were talking about with the first panel, I mean, what is the UK's relevance to the future of Syria? We have to think, what sort of role can we play? How can we engage with this? And I would have thought one of the areas where actually we should engage is in dealing with the British citizens who are for whatever reason in camps in northeast Syria. And because the one thing I think that we can offer the new Syrian government is this idea that the rule of law works, that community action can cope with security problems. It's not just all like Assad taking anyone who looks like a threat and putting them in prison and forgetting all about them. And indeed, during the Syrian civil war, there were quite a lot of British government-sponsored programs to try and encourage people in North Syria to understand about the rule of law, not just to swap one warlord for another, the engagement of women in particular, this sort of thing. And I think it's all of that piece. Britain can perhaps still provide some sort of soft power example of how you can manage security without, using a sledgehammer all the time.
And the UK certainly wouldn't, and certainly hasn't, said to other countries, don't take your people back, just strip them of citizenship if you can, if not, just ignore it. They have encouraged other countries to take people back. I'm sure there'll be programs in receiving countries where they'll be looking to support that. There's things like Prevent, where the UK is seen as very high up in terms of CVE programming, etc., etc. So,
a CVE program?
Countering violent extremism. So it's kind of on this counter-terrorism lens. So it really is. It appears a little disingenuous when they interact with states in different ways that they want to interact as UK policymakers.
So I think we just want to be completely clear about the security situation with regard to the prisoners, and I think that Phil wants to ask some questions about that, because I think we've touched on it, but I think we should sort of focus on it a little bit.
Yeah, so moving away from repatriation, but back to the prisons, there's been a concerted and coordinated effort by Islamic State to conduct jailbreaks to release their fighters from some of the prisons in northeast Syria. How damaging do you see those being, Mr. Jordan first, for regional security, but also vis-a-vis the UK's security?
I mean, obviously they could be potentially very damaging. The Islamic State, ISIS, will definitely use security vacuums and have been using security vacuums that have happened in different parts of Syria as there's been ongoing battles, you know, and certainly in the kind of northern Syria, northeast and northwest, where Turkey has continued to encroach and SDF have responded to that. ISIS have gained more ground, and as you say, they've looked at the reinvigorating the breaking the walls campaign, as they call it, whereby they're looking to break people out of prison. Richard mentioned about the one 2019-2020, where there was quite a significant one. What actually happened in that prison break was that a lot of the kind of younger males who were part of this whole piece we were talking about earlier were used by a lot of the detainees, a lot of the older males, as your kind of, you know, you're front and centre, so you'll get shot before me, when there was a security response to it. So again, this all kind of interlinks in the issue of particularly the youngsters, the children, because they will be involved in this very dramatically. I think in terms of the threat to the UK, you know, there's kind of two real threats, going back to the original question. You know, there's the sort of physical threat of ISIS being able to carry out operations either in the UK or on UK interests, but also there's the kind of ideological threat of ISIS being a recruiting tool, of, you know, being seen as an option, of enhancing extremism, and the camps and prisons are very useful for ISIS to do that. You know, they use that a lot as a recruitment tool. They use that to spread their propaganda. They use that to say, look at how the UK, the West, are treating their own citizens, look at how they're treating Muslims, etc.
And did they use the prison breaks as propaganda
Absolutely,
too?
Absolutely, yeah. You know, a lot of people escaped from that, and it took a while for a lot to be captured. Not all of them were captured. So there were people who were kind of in the wind and again had rejoined. There will always be that issue as long as there are those prisoners with no kind of progression. You know, and that's the whole piece of this, is that those detained in the prisons at the moment aren't really going to follow any judicial procedure. They're just there being detained. So there will always be that threat for as long as they're there that they will be broken out.
And how sustainable do you think it is that the current SDF control of those detention centres, those prisons, continues as it is, given what you've told us about the very precarious situation on the ground?
I mean, so the prisons are much more likely to be protected because of the coalition, the US and other troops in the region that will want to make sure. But it's not certain, you know, if there is a planned operation from Islamic State towards a prison, as happened. So what happened on that large-scale prison break was it actually was detected previously, and the coalition and the SDF managed to intervene, wrap up all of those cells, and then a few months later the same operation happened. So basically they'd planned just in case there was a security operation, so they had a backup team that then operated. So there is a lot of planning, there's a lot more opportunity for planning at the moment, and that's why there is a definite possibility. With the Turkish incursions, SDF are continually moving troops away from the camps and the prisons. So the level of security is going down in those areas. So again, the threat is going up.
There was a prison break in Raqqa in July, where I think 5 Islamic State prisoners were able to get out and free. And of course they would be regarded as heroes going back to base, as it were. And I think that the American assessment of the security of these detention centres was that a very high, or quite a high number, were actually distinctly insecure and needed considerable work to bring them up to scratch. I think, if I may...
Yet the guards have not been paid. And yet the guards have not been paid.
Well, quite. Guards not being paid doesn't help, of course. Prisons being very full doesn't help either. The refusal of access to NGOs doesn't help. They will still need to be fed and so on. But I think Islamic State are very happy in a way to keep women under these very bad conditions, and children too. That sort of helps their propaganda. It's quite a sort of conservative, if I may call it that, society where the men should be providing and the women should be just serving the men. But of course women in the Islamic State did much more than that. So they'd be much more interested in what I'm trying to say is breaking out the men than breaking out the women. The women are actually serving their purpose by being there. So I think that the anxiety expressed by the Americans about the security of these male detention centres is a very well-based one.
I think that we've been a bit free-flowing, to say the least. But I think that we haven't covered the last questions we were thinking about, which was the gathering evidence. And I wanted, Richard, if you wouldn't mind leading off on those.
Certainly. I'm curious to think a little bit about the consequences of having UK nationals repatriated. And I wonder if each of you could comment on community resilience back here and how you think the UK and society here could deal with the repatriation of some of these individuals. Why don't you start?
Yeah, we're not talking. We don't know exactly how many we're talking about. So it would be wonderful already if we could formally ask, because we don't know the exact number. But Reprieve estimates that there's about 60 UK nationals between men, women, and children. Right, most of them children, and most of them under the age of 10, which I think sort of puts this into perspective. We're not talking about hundreds of people, which sort of it wouldn't be a great strain on financial resources. It wouldn't, there is a very, very limited number of people that we are talking about. I think there needs a multi-agency response is what would be ideal in this circumstance, right? You're dealing with security assessments for the public, but also security assessments for the returnees. They may be returning to situations that are difficult, potentially. You need to assess their health, and that we've seen that there's very serious cases of malnutrition, of illness, etc. You need to assess their levels of education, their mental health. You need to assess their social needs in their communities. What kind of reintegration process is needed within the community? And so this seems like a lot, but again, we're not talking about many people, and most of the people we are talking about are small children, which maybe doesn't simplify the question, but it reduces the kind of elements that need to be dealt with. And this country has the social services and the kind of expertise that is needed to deal with this question. And we were talking about preventing violent extremism and countering violent extremism. The Prevent program, the Contest, all of this has been worked on for more than 2 decades now, and there is a very elaborate, I would say sophisticated, problematic, there are problems with it, but there is a system out there that can be galvanized to, that's the wrong word, but can be used to address this a managed return.
Yeah.
Just adding to that, I think it's important to say that UK citizens have come back, already, not just those, small number of repatriations, but sort of 2015, 2016, and from 2011 to around about 2016, British citizens did come back who had been fighting in that, and so there's a lot of experience of dealing with this already.
Sorry, these were people who were not put into camps. They just went out
and came back on their own. So it wasn't a repatriation. They turned up.
Do we have any idea how many there were?
I think about 300.
Yeah, there's a few hundred. You won't have an official, but it's hundreds basically. Okay. And I've been involved at local levels helping with returns. There is a very sophisticated strategy for this particular thing, for people coming back in these types of situations. The Home Office have had.
This is a 10-minute rule bill, which I think the Lib Dems are voting on, but I think Labour isn't, and I don't think the Tories are. So in those circumstances, I think because we've only got a couple of questions left, if it's all right, can I ask Abdeslam to pick up your questions? And so that we don't suspend. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Sorry, Chair. Thank you.
All right. Strange behaviour.
Cross-party committee in action.
Stop ringing in a sec.
Just stop in a sec. It rings twice. We become oblivious to it. I mean, it's
amazing. As long as it's not for me saying something I shouldn't.
Sorry?
As long as it's not a bell for me saying something I shouldn't. Yeah, so there is a very sophisticated strategy. You know, it's been running for a while. Prevent, which does have its detractors and does have its negative elements, does have, you know, a structure to it at the local level. Councils have some autonomy in that. And I think as well the other thing to say is that there's always a thought that, you know, how are communities going to react and what's going to happen if they come back. In general, communities just get on with it. They have much more important things to be thinking about, particularly now with so many other things that people have to think about, that generally these people are just reintegrated fairly quietly.
The small group of nationals who have been repatriated, what support have they been given? Are we aware of any support that they've been given?
My understanding, they haven't been given hardly any support. They've arrived at the airport and it was off you go. So there has been very little structured support upon their return in the UK.
In terms of prosecutions?
None, to my knowledge. But they're all children. I mean, 18 of them are children, and I think there's only 3 women who have been repatriated. So we're talking about minors, potentially very small children. So the UK had a policy.
These minors who've left their mothers behind.
No, the UK had a policy of they did repatriate orphans and unaccompanied minors. That was the position of the previous government, and so there was no prosecutions also because of that. In other countries, it was far more structured. In France, systematically, the woman would be arrested upon arrival and then gone through a investigation, and some of them were prosecuted, some of them were not.
I wonder if I just clear something up, because
yes.
I thought the position was that there had been an offer by the British that if the women gave up their children would be repatriated.
That is not my understanding of...
For some, basically.
Okay,
so the position moved from orphans and unaccompanied to case-by-case basis.
I see.
And the case-by-case basis was exactly that.
That might be my case then. Yeah. Right.
But I think European countries were very reluctant to split women from their children,
yes.
of course, you know.
And as well, I should say that the Kurds were very reluctant to do that as well, because, you know, a lot of countries wanted to take it in terms of rights of the child and say, well, you know, we want to separate them from their parents because your parents brought you here, and that's obviously not very good for you. But the Kurds were very difficult initially and said, you know, we don't want children separated from mothers, which was understandable as well, because the main basis for that was they didn't want to be stuck with the mothers.
Sorry,
so our final question. You referenced earlier how ISIS would use this as propaganda, the way in which citizens have been treated. Do you think, on that basis, all women and children should be repatriated?
My view is totally that women and children should be repatriated, and, you know, even that something has to happen with the men as well, you know. And so I'm saying that prosecutions, definitely, it's more difficult for the women, absolutely, but there has been prosecutions, as Harmony mentioned, Sweden, Germany, France, Netherlands.
Do you think it's a greater risk than being there to us long
Absolutely.
term than it is than being here?
It's a greater risk in all terms. You know, I think that the kind of the security risk in terms of the physical security, them being able to execute an operation, you know, is very much thinking, okay, if certain things happen and, you know, things slip up, they're all ready to be able to carry out pretty threatening things and kill people in the camps, etc. So how is that not a threat to other citizens? This is a UK citizen killing people in a camp, you know, and we're just saying, well, we're nothing to do with it. That's still an issue that UK does have responsibility for. The ideological side of things as well, that side of the threat is much more significant whilst they're in the camps. As Richard mentioned, ISIS are very happy for women and children to be in the camps. If there was a breakout and all of the women and children turned up and said, okay, great, look after us now, they wouldn't be able to. They wouldn't be able to. So they're quite happy. Okay, you guys look after them. If they die, it doesn't matter. We can then say, look, your people are dying because of the conditions. If they don't get food, again, that's down to you. So everything is very much on the countries, and ISIS don't have to do anything but use that as propaganda.
Sir Torres, I think you were trying to come in.
We are in this very odd and possibly unique situation where the head of counter-terrorism of the incoming Trump administration, Reprieve, Jonathan Hall, KC, and CENTCOM all agree on something. I don't think it's going to happen again, but it's happening now, and they all agree that repatriation is not easy, but it is the better policy, and it is better to manage it rather than to be all of a sudden finding ourselves with the camps being no longer guarded and we not knowing what is happening to these people. And that is true across so many people.
Right. Thank you.
That's it, unless we've missed anything, guys. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time. We do appreciate it. And if there's anything that we have missed, or anything when you're going home you think, oh, we should have said this, do write, and we will take your written evidence as much as your oral evidence. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience and for your time today. Thank you.